John McMullen wrote about it at 973ESPN.com. John, Mike Lombardi says that the Eagles head coach Doug Pederson is the least qualified head coach. Now, you can look at that sentence and say, okay, maybe he has a point, that this guy's qualifications were not really where anybody else's were, and maybe he does have a point. But he went on to say, when will the Eagles end this disaster? So it doesn't sound like he's just saying, look, the guy didn't have the qualifications. He's quantifying it by saying they need to end this disaster. Fair or unfair from Mike Lombardi?
Well, that's incredibly unfair. I was taken aback, and, we have sort of a hot take media environment, and I don't know if Mike was trying to do that. But some of the comparisons he made, bringing up Roy Rubin from the 9-73 Sixers, I was just talking to Josh off air. If you think about what Doug Pederson accomplished as a rookie head coach, he was 7-9. They traded his quarterback 8 days before the start of the regular season. One of his 5 best players was suspended for 10 games, and he finished 7-9. How does that correlate to Roy Rubin? And I wrote about it on 973 ESPN.com. One of the strangest things to me is in sports, and I brought up Derek Fisher in the NBA because I once wrote a column about it. The guy spent 18 years in that league as the floor leader for some of the greatest teams of the generation, and then he got a head coaching job, and people said he's got no experience. What is playing the game? How is that not experience? And I correlated to Doug Pederson and Sean McVay. If you think about Sean McVay getting the Rams job as the youngest head coach in NFL history at age 31, well, Doug Pederson was playing professional football at 31. So obviously he wasn't getting coaching experience. And what I bring up about Doug is he didn't make it 13 years in the NFL because he was talented. He was not talented. He knew the offenses back and forward, and coaches and big-time coaches, Shula, Holmgren, Reed, trusted him. I think it's one of the dumbest statements I've ever heard. And I don't even want to defend Doug Pederson, but I feel I have.
Yeah, I mean, coming from Mike Lombardi, who's been in the league a long time. I mean, this guy who's had some numerous GM jobs. He's been in front offices. He was with New England. He was in Oakland. He was in Cleveland. He was a well-respected guy. I mean, it seems like there's an agenda here, but what the hell would the agenda be? He worked with the Eagles for one season in 1998. Now, Peterson was not even there at the time as the backup or the starting quarterback at that time. So, I mean, can you find where this is coming from?
No, I can't. I mean, I have to take Mike at his word. I think he believes that. I talked to a number of players in the locker room yesterday. They were appalled by it as well. Nick Foles, particularly, who was, Doug was his quarterback's coach when he was here the first time, was really taken aback. Malcolm Jenkins thought it was silly. It's just, I don't see where he's getting it from. I mean, there's no resonation in the building that Doug Pederson is unqualified. So to say the Eagles need to put a stop to this, I don't know where it's coming from. Now, was he the Eagles' first choice? No. They wanted Adam Gase. Was he their second choice? No. They wanted Ben McAdoo. So I can only assume it comes from that and the fact that the Eagles were down to their third choice. But to call him the most unqualified candidate, you could look at Gase, who they wanted, and I argued in my column, Gase is more unqualified to be a head coach than Doug Pederson at this stage of the game. But he was successful the first year, and we'll see who ends up being the better head coach. I just don't, and I'm centering on that aspect of it. I don't see unqualified at all.
Isn't part of being
13-year player, and he's been under some of the best coaches in history.
But isn't part of being a good coach sometimes, John, knowing your limitations as the coach, meaning, hey, maybe I don't have the qualifications or the background or the experience, So I delegate. I find a strong defensive coordinator. I get an offensive coordinator that I can work with. Isn't that part of being a good head coach sometimes?
Well, yeah, I agree, and I say that all the time. I'm more of a fan of CEO-type coaches who delegate and let the offensive coordinator call that plays and the defensive coordinator handle that side of the ball, and then you can focus on the aspect of the entire game. And I talked to Tom Coughlin years ago about that, and he kind of explained that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen anywhere. If you look at head coaches, other than John Harbaugh, who came in as sort of a special teams maven, and that rarely happens. You can't find a coach who takes over an organization and doesn't call the plays on his particular side of the ball. And Coughlin explained it. He said, because you have to set the tone. Then once you set the tone in the organization, I think smart coaches, let up on the reins a little bit, and that's where you become more of the delegator. So I hope that happens with Doug Pederson. I don't know if it is going to happen. I do believe the CEO coach is the type that will be the most successful. You look at right now, Bill Belichick is a CEO coach, Pete Carroll's a CEO coach, but those guys are entrenched. And when Pete Carroll did it the first time, he called defensive plays. Bill Belichick called defensive plays. Everybody does it when they first get a head coaching job.
John McMullen with us. John, were there any parts of Lombardi's comments that did ring true with you? I mean, he said that the Eagles looked increasingly sloppy and unprepared as the 2016 season limped along, and he says that ain't changing in 17.
No, I think it's incredibly it's wrong. I think it's irresponsible. I think the expectations were out of whack after the 3-0 start. I think a lot of what happened to the Eagles last season were people adjusting to Carson Wentz and having a rookie quarterback struggle, and then he was banged up at the end of last season. If Mike wanted to point out that there was no balance on this offense, I think that would have been fair. There's a lot of things you can criticize Doug Pederson over. Being unprepared, I don't see that. I think the Eagles relied way too much on throwing the football with as I said, with a rookie quarterback, and on top of that, an awful receiving group. So I think that would have been fair to point out. But no, I don't get anybody like. At the end of the Chip Kelly era, you heard rumblings in the locker room. They were not happy. There were a lot of guys not happy with what was going on. A lot of the offensive players, mentioned that everybody knew what they were running, even if they did it off the record. You don't see that with Doug Pederson. You don't see guys trying to whisper and say this team's not prepared. I think, for the most part, people defended him. And as I said, there were certain guys, Foles specifically, who were appalled by the comments.
Well, John, you talk about the locker room, and sometimes these type of things can help bring a team together, and they rally around their head coach, not just in comments, but in play and action. Do you feel the players, do you think they really like Doug as a head coach, and this is the guy they're trying to rally around?
I think most like him. I don't get the feeling that he's, General Patton that people are going to run through walls for, but I think for the most part, people respect him and think this team is going in the right direction. I think this year has a lot to do with it. I think if this team overachieves, I think you're going to see that mentality take over. I think people are really going to start buying in and saying this program's going in the right direction. On the other hand, if it's an underachieving season, I think it could go in the other direction, and people could start questioning Doug Pederson and whether he's ready to be an NFL head coach. So I think a lot of it depends on what happens here. But after last season, Doug Peterson's grade as a head coach is still incomplete. I'm not trying to say he's Vince Lombardi, but to call him the most unprepared coach and not worthy in 30-plus years. I mean, think about the names than some of the coaches over the past 30 years. It's an absurd statement. Think of some of the coaches in this league right now, and put them in the position Doug Pederson was in last year. Are they coming out 7-9? It was out there.
I do feel that Peterson's a puzzling guy to kind of read, because yet the 7-9, it's not a great record. It's, slightly below average, and yet you look at that and say, man, did he do a good job considering? I find him to be odd, but is this a big season for Peterson? I mean, is he under the microscope regardless of these comments?
Well, sure. I mean, I think if they go backwards, for instance, and I don't expect them to finish 6-10 or 5-11, but hey, this is a league where injuries can take over, bad things can happen, and if the snowball starts going downhill the wrong way, that can happen to anyone. All of a sudden, people will start looking at those Mike Lombardi comments and say Mike was right. So I think it's very important he makes sure this thing starts going in the right direction. And when you say 7-9, it's below average. You're right, Mike, but you have to put the context on it. Very few teams go into a season where they spent the entire offseason preparing with Sam Bradford as the starting quarterback. And then 8 days, no, we're going in a different direction. And we're going with a rookie quarterback. And not only that, he didn't have a preseason because of the broken rib. So all of that enters into it. And then, as I mentioned before, with Lane Johnson and the 10-game suspension, we know their record with Lane, without him. That was big. There's context to it. Mm-hmm. And I go back to, on this show, when they traded Sam Bradford, I said 4 or 5 wins. So from that standpoint, 7 is pretty good from my perspective.
Hey, John, let's get into the 53 a little bit here. 8 linemen, that's tricky. 5 running backs, no way they're keeping 5 active on game day, that we know. 6 wide receivers, so some interesting movement on that. And by the way, John was the winner between all of the Phillies, the Eagles beat writers. He predicted 52 out of 53 correctly. That West Virginia guy bit you in the ass, and I'm happy about that. But
Shelton Gibson, and I like Shelton, and I'm happy for him. I am surprised he made the team, but you do have to look at what Howie did. He only cut 1 draft choice, and that was Nate Garrett. He was able to get him on the practice squad anyway. So in hindsight, I probably should have put more weight into that. But I did believe that Bryce Treggs outplayed him. Even Greg Ward outplayed him. But from the Eagles' perspective, you also have to weigh the fact you're probably going to be able to get those guys through waivers. They did. They're on the practice squad. So Howie was proven to be correct. I don't know if Shelton would have got picked up on waivers. I doubt it. But probably because of his status as a draft choice, it was more likely. So that, I think, is what Howie's thinking was by keeping him.
Any reason why, any reason why, I don't know if Doug's been asked this or Phipp or anybody, they haven't used him in the return game at all? He was a return man at West Virginia, a pretty darn good one. In fact, Dana Holgerson was on the show right after the draft and said he might be a little raw right away at wideout, but he'll help someone immediately in that part, and we haven't seen them do anything there.
Yeah, they haven't even used him in practice at kick returner, which I'm a little surprised by. But they're very good. They're tremendous with punt returning and Darren Sproles. And then at kick returner, they have a lot of confidence in Wendell Smallwood, who had the kick return for a touchdown last year. So I think he'll be the number 1 guy, and then Nelson Aguilar would probably be number 2. So they just haven't gone in that direction. The only thing I could guess is because I think Shelton was having a difficult time, learning the route tree. So they wanted him to concentrate on that and not be concerned with other roles. And that's something that's kind of natural. So if they do need him at some point to return a kick, I think he could step in there rather easily. So I think they didn't want to throw more on his plate, and he's not going to be asked to do that unless there's a lot of injuries. So that's probably why they went the way they did.
John McMullen with us, our 97.3 ESPN Eagles insider. John, how about some of the battles that they had? Obviously, the spotlight was on corner, and then you talked about the linebacker that they were able to sneak through. Linebacker, the front three guys, okay. Did they make the right decisions in your mind on the backup guys?
Yeah, well, I think certainly it's an issue depth-wise because there's not a lot proven there. But they are very good with the first three. So if you start looking at this team likes Joe Walker a lot. He was going to make the team last year as a seventh-round pick before tearing his ACL. So they have a lot of confidence in him. I'm not sure that's warranted. I don't think anybody knows if that's warranted until you see it. Najee Good, his versatility is so big for this team because he can play all three linebacker positions, and he's a very good special teams player. And then Camus, Grugier-Hill is just a tremendous special teamer, so that's why he's here. But I would be very concerned. The good part, though, is in today's NFL, everybody basically tries to spread you out. So you're only going to have two linebackers on the field the majority of the time, and the Eagles have three. So ultimately, I think that part of it works out well for them.
How about a defensive end? Because they say there's no greater motivation than potentially losing your job that gets you to work harder, right? Does Vinny Curry have a bounce-back year, and is he improved this year because he hears the footsteps of Barnett behind him?
Well, he should. I mean, it's a first-round pick, and it's a high first-round pick, 14th overall. So anytime you draft somebody that highly, you want him on the field, and you want him on the field sooner rather than later, and he's been impressive on top of that. So, yeah, I mean, Vinny's got to hear the footsteps. I think from the Eagles' standpoint, they think he's going to be better because he's healthier. He dealt with a nagging knee injury for the majority of last season. So I think the Eagles feel very, very good at that position as a whole because obviously Brandon's tremendous. They think Vinny's still good. They have a lot of confidence that Derek Barnett's going to contribute right away. And then they have Chris Long as well. And Jim Schwartz even mentioned Stephen Means. I mean, that could be the deepest position on this football team.
Yeah, we're talking with John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. He'll be in D.C. this weekend for the Eagles and the Redskins. We know the Redskins, that game, that was Vaitai. He got undressed in that game last year. Having Johnson back should change some things there. But I wonder, John, we talk about, the weapons they added. They threw the ball over 600 times last year with terrible weapons. Do you anticipate that they actually throw the ball more this year with better weapons?
Well, I hope not, but we have to see. I mean, I think they got to be more balanced. Frank Reich talked about that today. They go in thinking they want to be more balanced, and then they sort of default to the passing game. And you're right. When you think about defaulting to it last year with the rookie quarterback who was learning and didn't get much of a preseason because of the rib injury and the bad receiving core, they still defaulted to the passing game. So in theory, from that perspective, they have better receivers. You have Carson in year 2.
Right.
So they might be prone to throw it even more. You hope that's one of those things where we're talking about the Lombardi quote. That would have been a legitimate criticism where you could come at Doug and say, look, you got to be more balanced. And it doesn't matter that you have better receivers. You can't have Carson Wentz dropping back 607 times because, well, what happened? At the end, when Lombardi was calling them unprepared and looking like they were, haphazard, a lot of that had to do with the fact that Wentz was banged up. He wasn't healthy. And that's because he got hit so many times. He played through it, but the way you protect against that, a lot of it, is by not having him drop back 600 plus times.
Yeah. How do you just we'll talk more the rest of the week here, but how do you foresee the run game kind of being delegated?
Well, I think early on, LeGarrett's going to be the guy. I think as you get later in the season, if Wendell Smallwood can stay healthy, and that's a big if, I think ultimately the Eagles think he's going to be the bell cow back on this team. But I think that's for later in the season. I think it'll start with, as you expected to start, LeGarrette will be the guy. Darren Sproles will mix in. And then sort of Lindell will be the change of pace guy. And I just ultimately think at this stage of their careers, and it's funny to say because one's coming off an 18-touchdown season in the Super Bowl, and the other, I think, ran it 77 times last year. Lindell just looks like a better running back. And I think you have to let LeGarrette try first, but I think ultimately he's a better player, and he's going to prove that.
He's John McMullen, and you can hear him every day right here on the Sports Bash with all the Eagles insight. And, of course, check out his national column, FanRag Sports NFL. And John will be a part of the new Countdown to Kickoff show on Sundays. We'll give you more details on that. Of course, John will be in D.C. this week, so I'll be filling in for John for the pregame show. But we'll have more details, but we look forward to hearing that as well. Johnny Mac here on the Sports Bash, 97.3 ESPN. John, any quick feeling on the Ezekiel Elliott stuff? Are we going to get? Is he playing Monday? I mean, is this pretty clear that he's going to play now?
Yeah, I do think he's going to play week one. I think it'll be upheld. It's interesting. I think both sides should get on the same page because both sides look bad. I mean, if you saw that deposition from Ezekiel Elliott, he's not coming out looking good in this. And from the league standpoint, their lack of credibility and inconsistency in these issues don't look good. So I'd love to see it knocked down to 4 games and just get it over with. But I think they're going to fight, and it's going to go to federal court.
All right, more on that when the decision comes out. Thanks, John.
Hey, thanks, guys.